The last transmission from Sergeant Mara Voss came in on a Tuesday, which was how Corporal Devon Rask knew something had gone very wrong. She never checked in on Tuesdays. That was the rule she'd established herself. 3 weeks into her solo insertion behind Vorath lines, Tuesdays were radio dark because the Vorath signal crawlers ran pattern recognition on a 7-day cycle, and silence on a fixed day was harder to triangulate than silence on a random one. She had explained this in careful, slightly condescending detail the night before she'd gone in. Her kit spread across the briefing table, each piece of gear tagged and accounted for, her voice carrying the particular flatness of someone who has already decided the people she is briefing do not need to understand, only to comply. So when the transmission came in, clipped and half dissolved by distance, Rask did not reach for the decryption key. He reached for his jacket. The message decoded to 4 words. "Ned is awake here." He read it 3 times. Then he folded the paper into quarters and put it in his chest pocket and went to find Lieutenant Saren, who was eating her field rations on the hood of their crawler, watching the smoke columns rise from the eastern ridge. "She broke her own protocol," he said. Saren set down her spoon. "When?" 40 minutes ago. I was running equipment checks." Saren looked at the smoke for a moment. The Vorath had been burning the lowland settlements again, not out of cruelty, exactly, but because the Vorath did not distinguish between what they needed and what they simply found inconvenient. The settlements had grown too close to a communication node they were constructing. The people in the settlements had not been consulted. "What did she say?" He gave her the paper. She unfolded it, read it, folded it back, and handed it to him. That could mean anything. It means she found something. It means she broke cover to tell us she found something. It means whatever she found was more important to her than staying hidden. He looked at Saren. "She doesn't do that." Saren picked up her spoon again, then put it down a second time. "No, she doesn't." This was the problem with Mara Voss, and also the thing that made her the best field operative the Resistance's Eastern networks had ever produced. She did not break rules, not because she lacked imagination, but because she understood, at a level that seemed almost structural rather than intellectual, that the rules were load-bearing. Remove one, and something upstream collapsed. She had spent 4 years in Vorath-occupied territory, doing things that by any reasonable accounting should have gotten her killed, and the reason she had not gotten killed was that she maintained her protocols with a kind of religious fidelity. And when her protocols said Tuesday was radio dark, Tuesday was radio dark, even if the building she was hiding in was on fire, which made 4 words on a Tuesday the most alarming thing Rask had heard since the Vorath had first punched through the Kessler. Line 18 months ago, he told Saren this. She looked at the smoke columns for a long time. How long to the Spire district? 4 days by crawler. Maybe 3 if we push the night stretches. The checkpoint at the Narrows? Bribes or bypass. Either way, a day's delay. Saren was quiet. In the distance, a column of smoke bent sideways in the wind, spreading thin and gray across the sky. There were 12 Vorath signal crawlers working the eastern approach, and each one was capable of detecting a powered crawler at 6 kilometers on a clear day. Getting into the Spire district, which was the commercial heart of the occupied zone, and also, apparently, wherever Mara Voss had gone underground, was not the kind of thing that could be done quickly and cleanly at the same time. "Start the crawler," Saren said. "Which approach?" She stood up, leaving her rations on the hood, the one she'd use. Rask thought about that. He thought about all the times he'd watched Voss study a map, the particular stillness she went into when she was working out a route, not looking at the roads or the choke points or the obvious lines, but looking at the spaces between things, the places the map wasn't quite sure about, the marginal country that didn't belong clearly to any faction, and therefore didn't belong clearly to anyone's patrol schedule either. He thought about the fact that she had chosen the Spire district for her insertion point when half the analysts on their side had said it was suicide, and then she had survived 3 weeks in it when the other half had revised their estimate upward to certainty. "The old canal infrastructure," he said. "The parts the Vorath didn't bother mapping." Saren picked up her kit. "Get us there." They drove through the night. The Eastern Territories had been beautiful once, or so the population map suggested. A dense urban fabric, threaded with greenways and open plazas. The kind of city that had been built by people who believed in the future and had the surplus to invest in it. The Vorath had not destroyed it. Exactly. They had simply inserted themselves into it with the thoroughness of a new operating system, and in doing so had changed its function without meaningfully changing its form. The streets still looked like streets. The buildings still stood. But the movement of people through those streets and the purposes for which those buildings were used had been rewritten to serve a logic that was not human. This was what made the Vorath difficult to fight. They were not an army of occupation in any traditional sense. They were not particularly interested in control. They were interested in infrastructure, in the deep, boring, invisible layers of organization that made a civilization run. And they were very good at understanding it and very willing to repurpose it. The humans who lived in the occupied zone were not, by and large, prisoners. They were more like components. Useful components were maintained. Components that malfunctioned were replaced or discarded. Mara Voss had understood this from the beginning, which was why she had gone in not as a soldier but as a component. She had a cover identity, a work history, a registered skill set. She had made herself legible to the Vorath administrative system in all the ways that mattered and illegible in all the ways that didn't. She had been, to all appearances, a mid-level data technician, doing contract work for the redistribution networks, which were the closest thing the occupied zone had to a functioning economy. What she had actually been doing for 3 weeks was tracing the source of something the Resistance's intelligence analysts called the siphon. They didn't know what it was. That was the problem. They knew it existed because of the gaps. Places where data that should have existed simply didn't. Where people who should have had records had none. Where the Vorath's normally immaculate administrative infrastructure showed irregularities that the analyst couldn't account for by any known process. Something was reaching into the system and taking things out, and it was doing it in a way that was almost invisible, which meant it was either a Vorath operation so classified that their intelligence assets couldn't see it, or it was something else entirely. Voss had gone in to find out which. On the second night of the drive north, Rask took the late shift while Saren slept, and Voss sat in the passenger seat with her notes spread across her lap. The crawler's cabin was small, and the heating unit on the starboard side ran warmer than it was supposed to, which Rask had stopped noticing until Voss commented on it. "You've driven this vehicle a long time," she said. "About 6 months. You adjusted for the heating asymmetry." "Automatically, yeah. You lean slightly left on the long stretches, so the warmer air doesn't hit directly on the—" He stopped, because she was looking at him with an expression that meant he had just demonstrated something she had been thinking about. "That," she said. "What? That's what the Vorath can't model. You didn't decide to do that. You weren't told to do that. The heating unit is technically a malfunction. The correct response, by any formal protocol, would be to log it and request repair. Instead, you learned the specific shape of the fault and adapted your behavior to compensate for it, in a way that cost you nothing and improved your driving comfort by a marginal amount." She looked back at her notes. "They can model deliberate adaptation. They can model learning from explicit feedback. What they can't model is that." He drove for a while with this. "It's not impressive," he said finally, "adjusting for a heater. No. That's precisely why they can't model it. It's too small to be a strategy, and too consistent to be random. It's just the way people move through the world." She made a note. "When you multiply that across everything a person does in a day, in a year, across a lifetime, across a population, the accumulated weight of all the small adjustments, all the informal calibrations, all the non-logged adaptations, you get something that looks, from the outside, like chaos. But it isn't. It has a shape. The Vorath can feel the shape. They just can't find the principle underneath it. Rask thought about this. He thought about it for a long time, driving through the dark with the heater running warm on the starboard side, leaning slightly left without thinking about it. And the principle, he said, is a person. She said. There was a particular pleasure in driving through the occupied zone at night that Rask had never been able to entirely suppress. He knew this was perverse. The night made the Vorath's patrol patterns less predictable, and less predictable meant more dangerous, and the only way to navigate it safely was to keep all of his attention on the immediate, and none of it on anything beyond the next kilometer of road. But the night also made things simple in a way that the day didn't. In the day you saw what the occupation had done. The absence of ordinary human activity, the hollowed-out plazas, and the replaced signage, and the Vorath administrative kiosks, standing at intervals like teeth. At night you just drove, and the land was just land. Dark and untallogged, and its own he drove. Saren dozed against the window, and then woke and watched the sensors, and then dozed again. She had the gift of being able to sleep in segments, dropping in and out of consciousness with the precision of a timed interval, which she had explained to Rask once, as a skill she developed in the first 6 months of the occupation, when continuous sleep had not been an available option. She had explained it the same way Voss explained things, matter-of-factly, without drama, as though adapting to conditions that would have broken someone else was simply a thing that one did. The checkpoint at the Narrows was staffed by 2 Vorath compliance units and 1 human facilitator, a middle-aged man with the particular careful blankness that Rask had come to recognize as the expression of someone who had made a specific bargain with the occupation and was maintaining it with the same care that Voss maintained her protocols, not because he approved of it, but because it was the structure that was currently holding his world together. Rask presented his credentials without meeting the man's eyes, which was its own kind of courtesy. The checkpoint waved them through. The canal system was, as Rask had predicted, unmapped. Not entirely. The Vorath had catalogued it the way they catalogued everything, in the sense that it appeared as a feature in their geographic database. But they had not mapped it at the granular level that would have told you, for instance, that the third junction east of the old water treatment facility had a maintenance crawl space that connected to the sub-basement of a building the Vorath were using as a signal relay station, or that the relay station's sub-basement had a maintenance access point that led out into the underside of the Spire District's elevated commercial level. Rask knew these things, because Voss had sent them, in pieces, over the preceding 3 weeks. She had been building them a route in. She had been building it before she even knew she'd need it, which was either remarkable foresight or a deeply habitual pessimism about the likelihood of her needing an emergency exit, and with Mara Voss it was probably both. They went through the canal at a crawl, the vehicle's lights dimmed to almost nothing, the water running dark and slow around the hull. Rask drove, and Saren watched the passive sensors, and neither of them said much. There was not much to say. Either Voss was alive, and they would find her, or she was not, and they would find out what had happened to her. Either way, they were going. The maintenance crawl space was exactly where she had described it. The sub-basement smelled of ozone and old electronics and something else. Something Rask couldn't quite name. A faint, sweet chemical smell that made him think of the Vorath processing facilities he'd seen photographs of, the ones where they did whatever it was they did to human data. Not human people, human data. The distinction was one that the Vorath apparently considered significant. The access point was sealed with a standard Vorath lock, which Rask bypassed in under 40 seconds using the override codes Voss had sent 2 weeks ago, embedded in a routine logistics report, in a notation format that looked like a filing error. If you didn't know what you were reading, she had planned for this. Of course she had planned for this. The elevated commercial level of the Spire District was everything the propaganda imagery had suggested. A sprawling, climate-controlled environment that hummed with the quiet industry of a zone that the Vorath had decided was too economically productive to disrupt. People moved through it in the particular way of people under occupation. Purposeful, unhurried, eyes slightly downcast, the body language of someone who has learned that attracting attention is the same as inviting assessment. None of them looked at Rask and Saren as they emerged from the service corridor. Nobody looked at anybody in the Spire district, unless they were Vorath. There were 2 Vorath at the north end of the walkway. Not soldiers, administrators by the look of them, the low-profile field units that handled compliance and registration. They had the lean, slightly elongated build that Rask had come to associate with the ones that did interpretive work, as opposed to the denser, more heavily plated ones that did enforcement. Their eye clusters swept the commercial level in slow, overlapping arcs, processing at a rate no human could match, cataloging and filing and flagging. Rask and Saren had prepared for this too. Their cover identities were genuine. Data technicians, registered to a maintenance contractor that had been operating in the Spire district for 18 months. The Vorath liked contractors, because contractors meant no direct administrative burden. They would pass the eye cluster sweep, as long as they kept moving at a normal pace, and didn't do anything that read as anomalous. Rask had gotten quite good at moving at a normal pace. It had taken practice. The signal trace Voss had embedded in her last transmission led to a node on the western edge of the commercial level, inside a data management facility that the Vorath had licensed to a human intermediary company called Parallel Horizons. The name was typical of the occupied zone's commercial landscape. Corporate enough to be reassuring, vague enough to mean almost anything. Parallel Horizons did, according to its official filings, something involving distributed data processing for the redistribution networks. What it actually did, Rask suspected they were about to find out. The exterior of the facility was unremarkable. 4 floors, climate-controlled, heavy shielding on the upper 2 levels. The kind of shielding that the standard installer would register as privacy compliance, and not think about further unless they happened to know that the specific frequency profile of that shielding matched the frequency profile used by Vorath. DeepNet infrastructure. Saren noted it without commenting. They had both seen the photographs. The entrance was standard, biometric plus credential chip, the same as every other commercial facility in the district. Rask's cover identity had the appropriate clearance level. He pressed his hand to the panel and let it read him and thought about absolutely nothing in particular, which was the technique he had developed for these moments. Not calming himself, not suppressing his physiological response, but occupying his attention so completely with a genuine null that the stress markers didn't have anything to spike off of. The door opened. They went in. The first 2 floors were exactly what the filings described. Open plan data processing, humans at workstations, the low background murmur of a functioning workplace. The humans looked up when Rask and Saren entered, assessed them as maintenance staff, looked back down. The Vorath didn't have a visible presence on these floors, which was either because the work here was genuinely routine, or because the Vorath's presence on the upper floors made a visible presence down here unnecessary. A woman on the 2nd floor caught Rask's eye for exactly 1 second as he passed. She had brown hair going gray, and the kind of eyes that had been watching things long enough to have developed a professional neutrality over whatever they actually thought. She looked at him, and looked at Saren, and looked back at her screen. He didn't recognize her, but he recognized the look, the specific quality of not looking that was its own kind of recognition signal, the way you acknowledge someone in a space where acknowledgement itself was a risk. He kept walking. They found the service corridor on the east wall. Voss's trace had led to the 3rd floor. The stairwell between the 2nd and 3rd floors was where the facility stopped being unremarkable. It wasn't obviously fortified. There was no visible checkpoint, no armed presence. But the air changed. A slight increase in the sweet chemical smell, Rask had noticed in the sub-basement, and a faint subsonic pressure that he felt more in his teeth than his ears, and a quality of silence that was somehow too even, too consistent, the way a room sounds when all of its ambient noise has been carefully suppressed, rather than simply absent. Saren put her hand on his arm. He stopped. She tilted her head toward the east wall. He looked. There was a panel there, half hidden behind a maintenance duct bracket, that showed a faint luminescent edge. He hadn't noticed it on the way in. He wasn't sure he would have noticed it without her. Voss's work. It had to be. The luminescent edge was a marking agent she favored, colorless in standard visible light, visible in the near-infrared band that their contact lenses processed. She had been here. She had left a marker. She had been here and she had gone up. The third floor was where the shielding was, and whatever was behind the shielding was what had made Mara Voss break her own protocol on a Tuesday. They went up. The third floor looked, at first, like a server room, racks of processing units, cabling, the rhythmic blink of status lights in the dark. But the geometry was wrong. The racks were too large, the spacing between them too irregular, and the processing units themselves had a quality that Rask couldn't immediately identify as wrong so much as simply unfamiliar. The way a tool built for a different hand feels slightly off in the grip, even when it appears otherwise normal. Vorath hardware, not the surface-facing administrative interfaces they used to manage the occupied zone, but something deeper, something from the layer of their infrastructure that was not designed with human comprehension in mind. The casings had no visible ports or interfaces, just smooth, slightly warm to the touch panels that emitted the barest perceptible hum, the frequency just low enough that you registered it as a sensation before you registered it as a sound. Like standing next to a transformer, like standing next to something that was very busy, doing something you would never be shown. Saren had her scanner out. She moved between the racks, with the particular careful economy of someone who knows they are inside something, and does not yet know how thoroughly. The scanner's readout filled with data that Rask couldn't parse in real time, but that she apparently could, because after 30 seconds she stopped in the middle of the room and stood very still. "What?" he said. "The siphon," she said. "It's not pulling data out." He waited. "It's putting something in." He thought about this. He thought about the gaps the analysts had identified. The missing records, the erased histories, the people who should have existed in the system and didn't. He had assumed, as they all had, that something was taking those things away. It had not occurred to him that something might be removing them to make room. "For what?" he said. "I don't know yet." She was still reading the scanner. "But it's been doing it for at least." She stopped. Saren. She looked up from the scanner. Her face was doing something that Saren's face very rarely did, which was express something she hadn't decided to express. Rask. The missing records. The people without histories. Yes. They're not missing from the system. They're being redirected. He felt the change in the room before he understood it. A shift in the subsonic pressure. A slight alteration in the chemical smell. The status lights going from their rhythmic blink to a steady, undifferentiated glow. He grabbed Saren's arm. "Move." They moved. The Vorath that came through the far door was not an administrator. It was the other kind, dense, armored, moving with the particular sufficiency of something that had been built to cross a room quickly and then do something definitive at the other end of that crossing. It registered them in the half-second between the door opening and its first stride, and in that half-second its processing made whatever decision its processing was going to make, and then it was moving. Rask went left. Saren went right. This was not a plan they had discussed. It was a habit they had developed in the 18 months since the Vorath had punched through the Kessler line, and they had found themselves doing the kind of fieldwork that required very fast decisions, made in very close proximity to things that could kill them. You went opposite directions. You gave the target a choice. The target's processing had to solve a problem. Which one first? And what adjustment to make for the one it wasn't going for first? And while it was solving that problem, One of you was in a position to do something. The something, in this case, was Saren, driving her scanner edge first into the joint between the Vorath's armor plates, where its left limb met its torso casing. It was not the most effective attack. It was not the cleanest or the most elegant, but it hit a sensor cluster, and the Vorath's next stride went slightly wrong, and slightly wrong, in a room full of Vorath hardware rack edges and tight cable runs, was enough. It went down. It did not stay down. Rask had never seen one of the enforcement types stay down from a first hit, but it was down long enough for Mara Voss to come through the door on the south wall. She looked exactly like she always looked after 3 weeks in the field. Not worse, not better, just different. Harder in the way that came from long sustained attention, with the particular quality of alertness that had become her resting state. Sometime in the first year of the occupation, when she had stopped treating caution as a mode she switched into and started treating it as the baseline condition of being alive, she was carrying something under her left arm, a portable data unit, high capacity, the commercial variant, the kind that could be bought in any licensed tech market in the district. She looked at the Vorath. She looked at Saren and Rask. She said, "You're early. You broke Tuesday protocol," Rask said. "I did." She moved to the nearest server rack and began connecting the data unit with the efficiency of someone who has already done this in her head several times. "I found something that couldn't wait until Wednesday." The Vorath was getting up. "Voss," Saren said, "I know." She didn't look up from the connection. "Give me 90 seconds. Rask hit the Vorath with a maintenance tool from the nearest rack. It helped slightly. Saren hit it with the heel of her boot in the same sensor cluster she'd hit before. It helped slightly more. The Vorath expressed its response to these indignities by sweeping Rask into a rack of processing units and attempting to locate Saren with its secondary sensor array. 70 seconds, Voss said, from across the room. Rask got up. He picked up a larger maintenance tool. He thought about the analyst reports, about the missing records, and the people without histories, about Saren's voice saying they're being redirected. And he thought about the fact that Mara Voss had broken Tuesday protocol for this specific data, which meant she had assessed what was on this data unit and decided it was worth the exposure. And since Voss did not make that kind of assessment carelessly, he was probably getting hit by a Vorath enforcement drone in service of something that genuinely mattered. This did not make getting hit feel better, but it made the getting up part easier. Saren had found, in the 40 seconds since the fight started, what she was very good at finding in the opening seconds of any engagement: the leverage point. The Vorath were extraordinarily efficient and extremely fast, and nearly impossible to damage with standard human-scale tools, but they were machines in the precise sense that they were designed, and designed things had failure modes, and Saren had a gift for finding failure modes that bordered on the supernatural. She was doing something to the Vorath's lower sensor array with a piece of cable she'd pulled from a rack, and the Vorath was expressing its response to this by turning in slightly the wrong direction, which was less than ideal for it and marginally better for them. 40 seconds, Voss said. The door on the north wall opened. 2 more came through. This was the point, Rask reflected, at which most plans encountered what the old field manuals called contact reality. The moment when what you had planned and what was actually happening failed to correspond in ways that required immediate revision. He had a very clear memory of Voss explaining contact reality to him in the same careful, slightly condescending tone she used for things she considered foundational. You plan, she had said, until you can't. Then you improvise until you can plan again. The goal is to close the gap as fast as possible. He threw the maintenance tool at the left side one as it came through the door. Not because he expected it to do meaningful damage, but because the 2 seconds it spent tracking the trajectory of an incoming object were 2 seconds it wasn't spending tracking him. Voss, he said. 20 seconds. Saren was running. Not away. At the first Vorath, the one she'd been working on, positioning herself on its far side, so that the 2 new ones would have to go through it to get to her. It was a beautiful piece of spatial reasoning, and Rask had approximately 1 second to appreciate it, before he had to deal with the fact that one of the new ones had decided he was the more immediate problem. He went over a rack rather than around it. This surprised the Vorath, which he knew because it hesitated. 1/3 of a second of reorientation, and in that third of a second, he was on the other side of the rack, and moving toward where Voss was. "Done," she said. She pulled the data unit free. The connection point sparked. The server rack she'd been working on went dark, and then the room changed in a way that Rask did not have time to process until they were already running. The lights shifted, not off, but wrong, the steady glow becoming something else, something with a quality he couldn't name except that it made his teeth hurt and the back of his neck feel cold. The Vorath in the room stopped moving. Not all at once. There was a half-second of lag that was somehow worse than an immediate stop, the way a wave doesn't break the moment it begins to curl. But they stopped. Voss was already at the south door. Saren was behind her. Rask came through last, and as he cleared the threshold, he looked back into the room, and he saw the 3 Vorath, standing in the modified light, perfectly still, oriented not toward the door through which their targets had just run, but toward the server rack that was now dark, waiting, or processing, or something else that he didn't have a word for. He ran. The stairwell, the second floor, the entrance, the service corridor, the maintenance duct, the sub-basement, the canal. Voss knew the route as well as he did. She had built it, after all, and she ran it with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything, not sprinting, not panicking, keeping the pace at the exact speed that balanced fast enough, with quiet enough, calibrating it in real time against the acoustic environment. The way a person calibrates anything they've done so many times it no longer requires conscious thought. They came out through the canal junction into the pre-dawn gray of the eastern approaches, and Voss slowed to a walk, and Rask stopped looking behind them, and Saren put her hands on her knees and breathed. "The light," Rask said, when he had enough breath. "In the server room. What was that?" Voss was already securing the data unit in her kit. "That's what I need to show you." They found the crawler where they'd left it, undisturbed in the shadow of the old water treatment facility. The canal smelled of old metal and stagnant water, and the distant chemical sweetness of the occupied zone, which Rask was beginning to associate with specific things he would be better served not thinking about while he was still inside the Vorath-controlled perimeter. Voss connected the data unit to the crawler's analysis interface, and they crowded around the screen in the pre-dawn dark, and she showed them what she'd found. It took her 40 minutes to explain it, and another 30 minutes for Rask to understand it, and when he did understand it, he sat back against the crawler's hull and looked at the lightening sky and felt the particular quality of stillness that came from learning something that reorganized everything else you thought you knew. The siphon was not an intelligence operation. It was not a surveillance program. It was not even, in any meaningful sense, a weapon. It was a question. The Vorath had been in human space for 3 years. In that time, they had done what everyone who studied them had expected them to do. They had cataloged, mapped, assessed, processed. They had built their administrative infrastructure, established their redistribution networks, repurposed the existing human economic systems to serve their logistical requirements. They had behaved, in other words, like a highly efficient occupying force that was primarily interested in extracting value from a newly acquired resource. But they had also, quietly, been doing something else. They had been studying how humans broke, not physically. They understood that perfectly well. The enforcement types were testament to that. What they were studying was how humans broke psychologically, how they bent under occupation, which ones kept functioning and which ones didn't, which ones retained their baseline behavioral patterns, and which ones substituted new ones, which ones. And this was the part that made Rask's teeth hurt in a different way than the server room light had. Which ones seemed to become Something different after enough exposure to the Vorath's administrative presence. The missing records. The people without histories. They were not casualties. They were test subjects. The Vorath were not simply occupying human space. They were running a calibration protocol. They were trying to understand, at a deep operational level, what it took to alter a human being's fundamental processing. Not their behavior, which could be coerced, but the thing underneath the behavior. The thing that persisted. Some people had broken. Some hadn't. Some had broken and then reconstituted themselves in a new form that the Vorath apparently found interesting enough to study further. The records that had been removed from the system were the records of the ones who had reconstituted, the ones whose pattern after exposure differed in ways that the Vorath's models hadn't predicted. They were the anomalies, and the Vorath, who loved infrastructure and systems, and the deep boring machinery of organization, were building something based on what they had learned from the anomalies, something that was not an occupation force, and not a weapon, and not an administrative system, something that was trying to understand what a human being actually was. They don't know, Voss said when she had walked them through the data. After 3 years, they've mapped everything they can see, and they still don't know. Know what? Saren said. Voss looked at the screen. What's making the anomalies anomalous? She touched the data unit. They can model every input. They can predict behavioral outcomes with extraordinary accuracy for 93% of the population. But 7%, the ones who reconstitute, they can't predict. They can't find the variable. She looked up. They've been searching for it for 18 months. It's why they built the siphon. It's why they've been running the calibration protocol. They're trying to isolate the thing they can't see. Rask thought about this for a long time. He thought about a woman who had built them a route in before she knew she'd need it, who kept her protocols with religious fidelity, not because she had been told to, but because she understood them to be load-bearing, who had broken one protocol on a Tuesday, because she had found something worth breaking it for. He thought about Saren finding leverage points in the opening seconds of an engagement, about the way she had positioned herself in the server room to use the first Vorath against the second and third. He thought about all the people who had survived in the occupied zone for 18 months doing the same kind of thing in their own ways, in their own registers, the small invisible adaptations, the minute recalibrations, the things you did when you couldn't fight the system directly, and so you learned its shape and moved through it in the spaces it hadn't mapped. He thought about the fact that the Vorath, who could build a processing system capable of tracking 10,000 individual data streams, simultaneously could not find the variable. They're looking for a thing, he said. Voss looked at him. They're looking for a thing that isn't a thing, he said. That's why they can't find it. Saren sat up. Voss was still looking at him. The anomalies don't have something the non-anomalies don't have, he said. They just respond differently to the same pressures. They bend and they come back, and the shape they come back in is different from the shape they went in. But it's still them. He paused. The Vorath can model inputs and outputs, but they can't model the process in between, because the process in between isn't consistent. Every anomaly does it differently. There's no algorithm. There was a long silence. That's what the resistance is, Saren said quietly. That's what we've been this whole time. The sun came up. They sat in the shadow of the water treatment facility and watched it. And nobody said anything for a while, because there wasn't much to add to that. The data Voss had pulled was enough, more than enough. It was everything the Resistance's intelligence analysts had been trying to find for a year, laid out in the Vorath's own notation, comprehensive and detailed and, in its own way, almost pathetic. 3 years of exhaustive effort, entire systems built and running, a calibration protocol that was a masterwork of procedural complexity, and, at the center of it all, a simple absence, a space where the model was supposed to be and wasn't, and the Vorath, who could do so many things, unable to understand why. They drove back through the canal. They drove north through the marginal country, the unmapped spaces between things, along the routes that Voss had identified over months of careful study. They drove in shifts, and when it was not their shift, they slept in the crawler's cramped back section, and when they stopped for water and field rations. Voss went over the data again, on a small portable screen, and made notes in the compact notation she used for analysis. And Rask watched her, and Saren watched both of them, and none of them talked about what they'd found. Not because it was too large to talk about, but because talking about it required a language they were still working out. On the second night of the drive north, Rask took the late shift while Saren slept, and Voss sat in the passenger seat with her notes spread across her lap. The crawler's cabin was small, and the heating unit on the starboard side ran warmer than it was supposed to, which Rask had stopped noticing until Voss commented on it. "You've driven this vehicle a long time," she said. "About 6 months. You adjusted for the heating asymmetry." "Automatically, yeah." "You lean slightly left on the long stretches, so the warmer air doesn't hit directly on the—" He stopped, because she was looking at him with an expression that meant he had just demonstrated something she had been thinking about. "That," she said. "What?" "That's what the Vorath can't model. You didn't decide to do that. You weren't told to do that. The heating unit is technically a malfunction. The correct response by any formal protocol would be to log it and request repair. Instead, you learned the specific shape of the fault and adapted your behavior to compensate for it in a way that cost you nothing and improved your driving comfort by a marginal amount." She looked back at her notes. They can model deliberate adaptation. They can model learning from explicit feedback. What they can't model is that. He drove for a while with this. "It's not impressive," he said finally. "Adjusting for a heater. No. That's precisely why they can't model it. It's too small to be a strategy, and too consistent to be random. It's just the way people move through the world." She made a note. When you multiply that across everything a person does in a day, in a year, across a lifetime, across a population, the accumulated weight of all the small adjustments, all the informal calibrations, all the non-logged adaptations, you get something that looks, from the outside, like chaos. But it isn't. It has a shape. The Vorath can feel the shape. They just can't find the principle underneath it. Rask thought about this. He thought about it for a long time, driving through the dark with the heater running warm on the starboard side, leaning slightly left without thinking about it. "And the principle," he said, "is a person," she said. On the second day in the pre-dawn gray before Saren's driving shift, Voss put down her notes and looked at the dark country around them and said something that Rask would remember for a long time. She said, "They're afraid of us." Not triumphant, not relieved, just matter of fact, the way she said most things. The particular flatness that was not coldness but precision, the refusal to wrap a statement in more register than it needed. Rask thought about it. They're not afraid. They don't do fear. No, but they're allocating resources to a problem they haven't solved. They've been doing it for 18 months. For the Vorath, that's the equivalent of afraid. She looked down at her notes. They built an entire secondary infrastructure to study us because we don't behave the way their models predict. They're not trying to destroy us. They're trying to understand us, and they can't. "Is that better or worse?" Saren said, from the driver's seat. Voss thought about it. "It's information," she said. "What we do with it is up to us." They reached the Resistance's Eastern Network staging point on the morning of the 4th day. The briefing took 8 hours. There were 12 senior analysts in the room, and a secure link to the Western Coordination Committee, and Voss presented the data with the same economy of expression she brought to everything, walking them through the siphon, the calibration protocol, the anomaly records, the absence at the center of the Vorath's model. The analysts asked questions, and she answered them without embellishment, and when the questions ran out, there was a silence in the room that Rask recognized as the silence of people reorganizing their understanding. The quiet lasted nearly 3 minutes, which was a long time for a room full of analysts. One of them, a woman from the Western Network, with the look of someone who had been running threat assessments for a living. Long enough to develop a permanent furrow between her eyes, finally said, "Are you telling us that the most advanced intelligence system we've ever encountered has been spending 18 months failing to understand us?" "Yes," Voss said. "And this is good news." "It's information," Voss said. "What we do with it depends on whether we understand it correctly." The furrow deepened. What do we risk not understanding correctly? The temptation to use it as evidence that we're winning. Voss looked around the room. "We're not winning. We're hard to model. Those are different things." Hard to model means they can't predict us with the accuracy they need to administer us efficiently. It doesn't mean we're stronger than they are. It doesn't mean they'll stop trying. What it means is that the thing they're building their occupation strategy on has a structural fault. And we know where the fault is, and they don't. She paused. That's the beginning of something. It's not the end of anything. Nobody argued with this, which Rask thought said something about the room. The strategic implications took another 12 hours to work through. The short version, the Vorath's inability to model the anomalies, was not a weakness in any conventional sense. It wasn't something that could be exploited through standard asymmetric tactics. But it was a constraint. The Vorath's administrative systems were built on the assumption that human behavior was ultimately modelable. That given enough data and enough processing, the outcomes could be predicted. This assumption was built into every layer of their occupation infrastructure, the redistribution networks, the compliance systems, the signal crawlers, the calibration protocol itself. All of it was built on the premise that the human variable would eventually resolve. It wouldn't. Not completely. Not for 7%. And 7%, spread across a population of 12 million people in the occupied zone, was 840,000 people who behaved in ways the Vorath could not predict. 840,000 anomalies. The Vorath didn't know where they were, because the thing that made them anomalous was not a property that showed up in biometric scans or data, records. They were invisible to the system, the way a thought is invisible to someone trying to read it from the outside. "We find them," said the Western Coordination Committee's chair, after the 12 hours of strategic discussion, "and we use them." "They don't need to be used," Voss said. "They're already doing it. Most of them don't know that's what they're doing. They just survive in the way they survive, and the Vorath can't predict it. And so every time they encounter one of these people, the Vorath's model, it's a little more corrupted. We don't need to coordinate them." She paused. "We just need to protect the ones we can reach, and tell the ones we can tell, and let the rest of them do what they're already doing." There was a long silence. "And what are they already doing?" said an analyst from the far end of the table. Voss looked at her. "Being human," she said, "in all the specific ways that the Vorath can't account for." The room sat with this. Rask looked at Saren. Saren was looking at Voss with an expression that he recognized from the server room, the one she hadn't decided to express. He thought about what she'd said in the crawler, quietly, in the pre-dawn dark. That's what the resistance is. That's what we've been, this whole time. He thought about Voss building the Marud in. He thought about himself going over the rack instead of around it, because it was the faster path, and he'd processed the geometry in under a second without deciding to. He thought about the Vorath in the server room, stand still in the altered light, oriented toward the dark server rack, looking for something to model. He thought about all the times in the last 18 months when the worst had happened. And the people around him had bent and come back, each of them in their own way. And the shape they'd come back in had been different from the shape they'd gone in, but it had been unmistakably, undeniably themselves. And he thought about the fact that this was not a quality that could be quantified or systematized or built into a protocol. It was not a weapon. It was not a strategy. It was just the thing that was true about humans that wasn't true about anything else the Vorath had ever encountered. He was still thinking about this when Voss pulled the data unit out of her kit and set it on the briefing table and said, "There's one more thing." Everyone looked at her. The calibration protocol has been running for 18 months, she said. In that time, they've generated records on approximately 200,000 anomalies. Cross-referenced with the redistribution network data, which I had time to pull, while Rask and Saren were handling the enforcement units. She touched the data unit. We have names, addresses, current status flags. The room was very quiet. We can reach them, she said. This was the part that Rask had not had time to process in the canal, or in the crawler, or in the 20-hour drive back through the marginal country. He processed it now. 200,000 people who were anomalous in exactly the way the Vorath couldn't account for, identified and located and flagged in a database that the Vorath had built to study them, that Mara Voss had pulled in 90 seconds while an enforcement unit was trying to close the distance across a server room. She had planned for this before she knew she'd need it. She had built the route to the data. And then she had built the extraction path for the data itself, and when the moment came, she had executed in 90 seconds. He thought about the 2 seconds he'd bought by throwing a maintenance tool at an incoming Vorath. He thought about Saren's cable in the sensor cluster. He thought about all the small particular, humanly specific things they had done in that room, none of which were optimal strategies, and all of which had worked because they were adaptive and unpredictable and slightly wrong in exactly the right ways. The Vorath couldn't model it. He was starting to understand why. The operation to reach the 200,000 took 6 months. It was not, by any measure, a military operation. It did not look like the resistance activities that the occupation forces were trained to identify. No weapons caches, no communication networks operating at detectable frequency, no organizational hierarchy susceptible to decapitation. It looked, to the degree that it looked like anything, like the occupation zone's normal background noise. People moving, people talking, people doing the 10,000 small things that people in an occupied territory did to maintain some approximation of ordinary life. Voss ran it from 3 different locations, moving between them on a schedule that she did not share with anyone, communicating through a series of dead drops and relay contacts that she had been building for the better part of a year. Rask ran the northern approach, Saren ran the southern, and between them they reached approximately 40% of the names on the list, with a message that took many forms depending on the recipient, but that amounted at its core to, you are not alone, and you are not random, and what you are doing matters. Most of the people on the list were not resistance members. Most of them were not doing anything that looked, from the outside, like resistance at all. They were teachers adjusting their lesson plans to account for the Vorath's curriculum mandates in ways that preserved something the mandates were designed to eliminate. They were small business owners finding ways to maintain informal economic networks that the redistribution system wasn't designed to accommodate. They were parents doing the specific invisible work of raising children who knew what the world had been and who they were in it. They were people who played music, badly in many cases, in the evenings, which served no strategic purpose and which the Vorath found statistically anomalous. They were people doing the things people did when they refused, not as an act of political defiance, but as an expression of fundamental nature. To be anything other than themselves. There was a man in the Spire district who repaired mechanical clocks. The Vorath had no category for this. They had no category for it, because it was economically inefficient. Functional timekeeping was a property of every network device. The calibration was continuous and automatic, and mechanical clocks were imprecise by definition. The man had been flagged as anomalous in the calibration protocol's 14th month of operation, because the Vorath's models kept predicting he would stop, and he kept not stopping. People brought him clocks that no longer kept accurate time, and he fixed them. And the people took them home and set them on their shelves, and the clocks kept time with the particular slight inaccuracy of mechanical things. And the man was apparently content with this. In a way, the Vorath's model, classified as computationally indeterminate. Rask found him through the relay network, in a small repair shop that smelled of machine oil and old metal. He was in his 70s, with the deliberate, careful hands of someone who had spent decades learning to be precise with small things. And he looked at Rask when Rask came in with the particular look of someone who had been expecting something without knowing what. Rask gave him the message. He read it carefully, and he set it down on the counter, and he looked at the clock he'd been working on. A small carriage, clock, late preoccupation manufacture, its movements spread across a cloth in careful sequence. "I know," he said. Rask waited. "I knew. It wasn't random," the man said. "You don't do a thing for 40 years and not know the difference between noise and pattern." He looked at Rask. I didn't know what the pattern meant. Rask thought about what Voss had said. About being human, in all the specific ways the Vorath couldn't account for. About the weight of small adjustments accumulated across a lifetime. "It means you're very difficult to predict," he said. The man almost smiled. He picked up a small gear and held it to the light. "My wife used to say that." The Vorath kept calibrating. Kept building toward whatever the siphon was building toward. Kept generating records on anomalies that behaved in unpredicted ways. Adding data to a model that grew more elaborate and more comprehensive. And no, closer to its answer, because the answer was not in the data, and no amount of data was going to find it there. On the first day of the 7th month after the server room, Voss called a meeting. Rask came from the north. Saren came from the south. They met in a location Voss had identified. A decommissioned agricultural facility in the marginal country between the occupation zone's eastern edge and the Resistance's staging area, which was technically neither occupied nor controlled by anyone, and which the Vorath's mapping systems therefore treated as a functional null. Voss was already there when they arrived. She had, as always, gotten there before she needed to. She showed them what the siphon had done. The model the Vorath were building, the thing the calibration protocol was generating toward, was not a weapon and not a map and not a strategy in any conventional sense. It was, in the Vorath's own notation, a comprehension architecture, a structured attempt to contain within a formal system the thing they had been unable to predict. It was, in other words, a model of the anomaly, not of any specific anomaly, of the principle of the anomaly itself. The Vorath, unable to resolve the variable through data collection, had shifted approach. They were now trying to build a formal structure that could, by incorporating the anomaly as a category rather than a mystery, at least limit its operational impact. They were building a box to put the inexplicable in. "They're scared," Saren said. "They're practical," Voss said. "They've decided they can't solve it, so they're managing it." "Same thing," Rask said. Voss almost smiled. He'd seen her almost smile a handful of times in the 4 years they'd worked together, and each time it was the same expression. Not amusement, exactly, but a kind of acknowledgement, a recognition of something real. She did it the way she did most things, economically, without excess, but genuinely. "The architecture," she said. "Look at the parameters." They looked. It took Rask several minutes to understand what he was seeing, because the Vorath's notation was dense, and the structure of the comprehension architecture was designed to map a principle rather than a behavior. But when he understood it, he felt the same stillness he'd felt in the crawler, the stillness of something reorganizing. The box the Vorath were building wasn't a containment. It was a translation. They were trying to render the anomaly, the thing that made humans unpredictable, into a form that their systems could process. And in doing so, they were forced to engage with the thing they had been trying to avoid engaging with, the interior of it, the part that wasn't visible in the data. They were building a formal model of the human interior, of the part that bent and reconstituted, of the 7%, and the formal model was wrong, in ways that were, to anyone who knew what it was supposed to be modeling, almost poignant. It was right about the mechanics. It captured the input-output profiles accurately, the behavioral shifts before and after exposure, the reconstitution patterns. It modeled the capacity for adaptation with reasonable fidelity. What it couldn't model was the why. The Vorath had no category for it, because they had never needed one. The why of a thing, for the Vorath, was always explicable in terms of function. What a system was doing and how, and whether those operations served for some larger operational goal. But the why at the center of the anomaly was not a functional why. It was the kind of why that didn't point to an output. It pointed inward, to a thing that existed because it was itself, and not because of what it produced. The Vorath could not model it, because they had never needed to model something that existed for its own sake. They built a box, Rask said slowly, and the box doesn't fit. The box will never fit, Voss said. Saren was quiet for a long time. Then she said, so what do we do with this? What they did with it was simple in conception and brutal in execution. The comprehension architecture, the box the Vorath were building, was the most significant piece of infrastructure they had created since the initial occupation. It was the thing they were building the siphon toward, the goal of the calibration protocol, the reason for the sync records and the redirected histories and the 200,000 anomalies. If it was completed, it would not give the Vorath the ability to predict the anomalies, but it would give them a formal classification for the thing they couldn't predict, which was a different kind of power. The power of having named a thing, and named things could be administered, and administered things could be controlled. Voss did not want the architecture completed. She did not specifically want to destroy it. Destroying Vorath infrastructure invited reprisals of a scale that the occupied zone's population could not absorb. But incomplete architectures in the Vorath's own operational logic represented misallocated resources, and misallocated resources triggered the kind of administrative reassessment that could, if managed carefully, result in the project being deprioritized, scaled back, eventually suspended. The way to make it incomplete was to introduce into the dataset the architecture was being built on a systematic error, not a random error. The Vorath's quality control systems would catch random errors almost immediately. A structured error, an error that was, in its own way, a comprehension architecture of its own, one that told the Vorath's model something internally consistent and entirely wrong about the nature of the anomaly, building a structure that would take enormous resources to dismantle once installed. It required the kind of data manipulation that Voss had spent 4 years getting good at. It required access to the siphon, and it required the anomaly data from the calibration protocol, not to use against the Vorath, but to use to understand what the Vorath thought they were seeing, well enough to construct a convincing, alternative version of it. It required, in short, everything they had. Voss laid out the operation over 3 days. It was the most complex piece of planning Rask had ever watched her do, and he had watched her do things that had required planning on a scale that most people in the Resistance considered impossible. She built it in the same way. She built everything, starting with the load-bearing elements, the things that everything else depended on, and working outward from there until the structure was complete. When she was done, she showed it to Rask and Saren, and let them tear it apart for 6 hours, which was the way she always presented plans, as structures to be tested, not directives to be followed. They found 4 problems. She had already thought of 3 of them. The 4th one she fixed while they watched. The window in the siphon access, she said. 72 hours, maybe 80. It's the longest gap in their cycling protocol that doesn't trigger an anomaly flag. That's not very long, Saren said. No, for a data insertion that size. No. They looked at each other. They looked at Voss. Who else? Rask said. She told them. She had been building this part for 3 months. The list she read was not long. 14 people, drawn from the 200,000 anomalies, selected for specific skill profiles, and for the particular quality that the Vorath's comprehension architecture had tried and failed to contain. People who had bent and reconstituted. People who did things in ways the Vorath's model hadn't predicted. People like them. People like the clockmaker, who had spent 40 years learning to be precise with small things and had transferred that precision to every other domain of his life without ever naming it as a skill. People like a young woman Saren had found in the Southern network who had been a supply logistics clerk before the occupation and had spent the 18 months since building an informal distribution network for medical supplies that moved through the occupied zone with the kind of invisible efficiency that official channels couldn't achieve precisely because it didn't look like a network at all. It looked like people doing small favors for people they happened to know. People like a former civil engineer who had spent a year and a half creating detailed maps of every structural anomaly and maintenance fault in the blight occupied zone's physical infrastructure. Not because she was planning anything specific, but because mapping was what she did. And these were things worth knowing. There was a teenage boy on the list who had, according to the calibration protocol's records, developed the habit of routing his daily commute through 7 different paths on a rotating schedule that the Vorath's movement tracking system had failed to reduce to a predictable pattern after 11 months of observation. He did this not because he suspected he was being tracked. He almost certainly didn't, but because he found the same route boring. The Vorath had no category for boredom. They had no category for the specific human phenomenon of doing a thing differently, simply because sameness, for its own sake, was unsatisfying. Rask had spent half an hour finding him in the relay network, and another 10 minutes not knowing how to deliver the message to someone who was, by any external measure, just a kid walking to school. He had ended up sitting across from him in a corner of a licensed market and saying, more or less, there's something specific about how you move through the world that matters. And I can't fully explain it, but I can tell you that it's been making something very large and very confident look slightly stupid for almost a year. The boy had looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Can I still take different routes?" "Yes," Rask said. "That's the point." The boy thought about it. "Okay," he said. There was a woman on the list, in her late 40s, who had been a grief counselor before the occupation, and who had continued doing something functionally similar afterward, which the Vorath's behavioral models had flagged as anomalous, not because grief counseling was prohibited, but because the informal sessions she ran, in apartments, in market stalls, in the margins of the occupied zone's official administrative life, produced measurable changes in the behavioral profiles of their participants that did not correspond to any recognized adaptation pattern. The Vorath had been trying to model what she was doing for 8 months. The closest they'd gotten was a notation that read, in their system's notation, "Subject appears to affect behavioral recalibration through unknown mechanism. Mechanism does not appear to require external input or feedback system. No analogous process in known datasets." She had read the message Rask brought her, and she had sat with it for a long time in the kind of silence that was not empty but occupied. Then she said, "They can't model grief. Apparently not. They can't model the thing that comes after grief either. That seems to be closer to the problem." "Yes." She had nodded, with the weight of someone who has spent a long time watching people move through something vast and formless and emerge on the other side in shapes they hadn't expected, and had come to understand that the emergence itself was the thing and not a failure to avoid what preceded it. "I'll do it," she said. She contacted each of them through the network they'd been building for 6 months. 5 declined. 9 said yes. The clockmaker said yes. He said it in approximately the same way he'd said everything in the 20 minutes Rask had spent in his shop. Quietly, with the weight of someone who had been waiting for a long time for the question to be asked, in a form he could answer honestly. 11 people, total, 200,000 supporting unknowingly from the periphery, simply by being what they were. The Vorath's calibration protocol continuing to run, the comprehension architecture continuing to grow toward its wrong conclusion, and at the center of it all, a 72-hour window and 11 people with something to put in it. The operation ran on a Tuesday. Voss made it a Tuesday specifically, because the Vorath's signal crawlers ran pattern recognition onto a 7-day cycle, and the gap in the cycling protocol that she was using opened on a Tuesday, which meant that the day she had made radio dark for 4 years was the day she was choosing to run the loudest operation of her career. She explained this to Rask the night before, matter-of-factly, as if it were simply a scheduling note. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "You knew, from the beginning, that it would be a Tuesday." She looked at him. "I knew when I saw the cycling protocol data that the window opened on a Tuesday, yes." "When did you see the cycling protocol data?" She was quiet for a moment. "Before I went into the Spire district," she said. He thought about this. He thought about Tuesday being radio dark, and about the transmission that had come in on a Tuesday, and about the 4 words that had meant she'd found what she'd gone in for. He thought about the route she'd built them into the facility, and the access codes she'd sent 2 weeks early, and the marking agent on the 3rd floor wall. He thought about the way she said, "I planned for this," without saying, "I planned for this." "You've been running 2 operations," he said. "I've been running 1 operation," she said. "The other part of it just took longer." He laughed. He didn't do it often. It felt out of place in the occupied zone, or it had until recently, until the past 6 months of doing the work that felt less like resistance and more like a slow restoration of something that had been muted and not destroyed. But he did it then, in the night before the Tuesday operation, and Voss looked at him with the almost smile and said nothing, because she didn't need to. The operation ran for 71 hours. It ran in the gaps in the marginal spaces, in the parts of the Vorath's infrastructure that the signal crawlers moved through, without fully mapping. It ran through the canal and through the maintenance crawl spaces, and through the data conduits that the Vorath had repurposed from the human cities' original communication networks, which still ran as in places as in the patterns the original engineers had designed, and which the Vorath had never fully remapped. Rask ran the northern data relay. Saren ran the southern. 7 of the 9 anomalies ran the insertion points, moving through the siphon access in shifts, each one working the piece that was calibrated to their specific skill set, the way you solve a problem that's too large for one person, by distributing it across people who are good at different parts of it. It was not elegant. It was not clean. There were 3 moments where everything nearly broke, and each time it was caught by someone other than the person whose job it was to catch it. Because in a distributed operation across 11 people running on human intuition rather than algorithmic prediction, the thing that saves you is the same thing that makes you hard to model: the capacity to do the right thing at the right time, without having been specifically assigned to do that right thing at that time. The 7th person on the northern relay caught the cycling anomaly in hour 48. She was a teacher from the occupied zone's educational administration, not a data specialist, not an operative, just someone who had spent 3 years adjusting lesson plans in the marginal spaces, and had learned, in doing that, how to read a system's rhythm well enough to know when something was off. She caught it the same way she'd learned to catch the Vorath's curriculum review cycles, not by analyzing the data formally, but by feeling the pattern go wrong. The way you feel a sentence with a grammatical error before you've consciously identified the error. She flagged it to Rask. Rask passed it to Voss. Voss adjusted. In hour 63, one of the insertion point contacts was flagged by a Vorath signal crawler. He was not arrested. His cover identity was solid, but the flag meant his access to the insertion point was going to close in approximately 4 hours, faster than his remaining work required. He finished what he could and passed the remainder to the person next to him in the network, someone he'd met once, briefly, 6 weeks earlier, during the initial contact phase. She took it and ran it in the remaining time. She did this not because she had been trained to do it, or briefed to do it, but because it was the obvious next thing. And humans were, in Rask's experience, almost universally good at identifying the obvious next thing when the situation was clear enough and the values at stake were ones they actually held. The clockmaker worked his section at hour 57, in the dead zone, between the northern and southern signal crawler sweeps. His piece of the insertion was the most granular. The fine calibration work at the heart of the structured error, the part that required the kind of precision that came from 40 years of handling small mechanisms in low light. He worked it the same way he worked a clock movement, methodically, without rushing, checking and rechecking, unhurried by the awareness of what was at stake, in a way that Rask found almost surreal, until he realized it was not the absence of fear, but the application of the same quality that made him an anomalous in the first place. The capacity to hold the immediate task as the complete world, to give it exactly what it required, and no more and no less. Rask watched the clock on his relay terminal and did not say anything. The grief counselor worked her section at hour 66. Her piece was different, not fine calibration, but broad architecture, the framing around the structured error that would make it legible to the Vorath's comprehension systems as a resolution rather than a disruption. This required understanding the Vorath systems well enough to think the way they thought, to render the error in a grammar they could accept, which turned out to be exactly the thing she had spent 18 months doing, with the people who came to her in their apartments and their market stalls, not giving them her own understanding of what they were going through, but entering far enough into their understanding to speak back to them in it. She had explained this to Rask when he'd described her piece of the work, with the same matter-of-fact weight she brought to most things. You have to know how something understands itself, she'd said, before you can tell it something it will believe. She ran her section in 40 minutes, which was 20 minutes under the allotted window. She used the remaining 20 minutes to check the clockmaker's section, found one minor calibration drift and corrected it. She had not been assigned to check the clockmaker's section. Rask would ask her about it later, and she would say, "I noticed it was adjacent, and I had the time." It seemed like the obvious thing. Humans, Rask thought. 40 years from now, some Vorath analyst was going to dig this operation out of a historical archive and try to model how an 11-person network with no formal coordination structure had managed to pull this off. And the answer was going to look from the outside like chaos, and it would have a shape, and the shape would not have a name, and the analyst was going to understand exactly as much as their predecessors had, and no more. In hour 71, the insertion was complete. The structured error went in the way Voss had planned it. The comprehension architecture received it without flagging it. It was consistent with everything else in the dataset, internally coherent, thoroughly convincing, and wrong in a way that would take the Vorath systems months to identify if they were looking for it, and if they weren't looking for it, possibly never. It told the Vorath's model something that was, in its own way, the most honest possible misdirection. It told the model that the anomaly was a function of environmental exposure, that the variable the Vorath had been looking for was external, a product of specific contextual conditions that could be identified and controlled for. It told them to keep looking for something that wasn't there. And since it was internally consistent with everything else the calibration protocol had generated, and since it gave the comprehension architecture the formal resolution it had been building toward, a named category for the thing that had been inexplicable, the architecture accepted it and built on it and closed into itself around it, a complete structure, a finished model, a beautiful and total and wrong answer. The Vorath, being the Vorath, accepted the completed architecture and began allocating resources accordingly. On the evening of the third day after the operation, in the decommissioned agricultural facility in the marginal country, Voss connected her portable screen and showed Rask the Vorath's administrative record for the Sci-Fi project. Status, Phase 2 complete. Resources reallocated. Anomaly variable, resolved. Rask read it twice. Then he read it a third time. "They think they solved it," he said. "They think they solved it," Voss said. "They're going to find out they didn't." Eventually, she put the screen away. In the meantime, the calibration protocol has been suspended. The Sci-Fi is going to be decommissioned. The 200,000 records are going back into the standard administrative database. She looked at him. The people on those records are going to stop being anomalies, from the Vorath's perspective. They're going to become normal components again. Is that better? Saren said. Being a normal component? It's better than being a study subject, Voss said. And it gives them room. She paused. The comprehension architecture is going to drive the Vorath's occupation strategy for at least 6 months, probably more. It tells them the variable is environmental. That means they're going to start adjusting the environment, which means they're going to be making changes to the administrative infrastructure that their own architecture predicts will reduce anomalous behavior. She waited. That means, Ras said slowly, they're going to create gaps. Predictable gaps, she said, based on a model we built. He looked at her. He thought about a route built before anyone knew it would be needed. He thought about access codes sent 2 weeks early. He thought about a Tuesday made radio dark for 4 years, and the one Tuesday it wasn't. You're not done, he said. I'm done with this operation, she said. The next one starts when the gaps open. Saren looked at the sky outside the facility's open roof. It was evening, one of the specific evenings of late spring, when the light went golden before it went dark, and the marginal countries, scrubland, caught it in a way that made it look briefly like somewhere else, somewhere that was only itself and not the overlap of two competing systems. A long way off, a bird was calling in the cooling air, the same 4-note phrase repeated, with the patient, inexhaustible precision of something that had been doing it long before any of this and intended to go on doing it after. Rask listened to it. He thought about the Vorath's model and the box that didn't fit, and the fact that somewhere in the occupied zone, right now, the clockmaker was back in his shop with his mechanical clocks and his machine oil and his 40 years of careful small precision, and the Vorath systems had recategorized him as a normal component and moved on, and he was still there, still doing the thing he did, still anomalous in exactly the same way he'd always been anomalous, and the Vorath would not know it for months. He thought about 840,000 people like that. He thought about all of them doing the 10,000 small things, the informal calibrations, the non-logged adaptations, the heater on the starboard side of the crawler, and the slight lean to compensate for it. All of it, accumulating, all of it, adding up to something that looked like noise from the outside and had a shape from the inside, a shape that was not a strategy and not a protocol and not a weapon, but was simply the aggregate expression of what they were. He thought about the grief counselor in her apartment, tonight doing the thing she did, entering the understanding of someone who was breaking and helping them find the shape they would reconstitute into, and in doing so producing in the Vorath systems a data point that the comprehension architecture, with its beautiful and total and wrong model, would classify as resolved, normal, predicted. He thought about the teenage boy taking a different route home. He thought about the supply logistics clerk whose informal medical network had already moved 3,000 doses of antibiotics through the occupied zone in the past 2 months, without triggering a single administrative flag, not because she was careful. She was, but carefully was not the thing, but because her network did not look like a network from the outside. It looked like people, being people, doing the obvious next thing. How long? Saren said. Until the gaps open. 3 months, maybe 4. Voss looked at her notes. The architecture is thorough. The gaps will be deep when they open. 3 months. 4 months. 6 months, and 72 hours and 4 years of a Tuesday never used. And somewhere in the marginal country, a bird calling the same 4 notes in the evening air. Rask thought about the server room. He thought about Saren's cable in the sensor cluster and his own body going over the rack rather than around it. He thought about the teacher who had felt the pattern go wrong before she'd consciously identified it as wrong. He thought about all the people in the occupied zone doing the 10,000 small things that people did, adjusting and adapting and reconstituting, each of them in their own way, each of them doing the specific thing they did because it was who they were. and not because of what it produced. He thought about the Vorath, standing in the server room, perfectly still, oriented toward the dark server rack, looking for something to model. He thought about the fact that the thing they were looking for had been there, all along, building a route in, before it knew it would need one. He looked at Voss. She was making notes for the next operation. She looked up, the almost smile again. 3 months, he said. 3 months, she agreed. He looked at Saren. She was still watching the evening light fail, that particular gold going amber, going gray, the scrubland, holding the last of it at the horizon line. He thought about everything she'd seen in 18 months, everything any of them had seen, and he thought about the fact that she was still watching the light because it was worth watching, and that the Vorath's model had no category for this either. No category for the specific human tendency to stop, for a moment, and attend to a thing simply because it was beautiful, and because you were there to see it, and because not seeing it would have been a waste. He shouldered his kit. The bird was still calling in the distance, patient as stone, 4 notes in the evening air, unchanged and unchangeable, and no more, and no less than exactly what it was, he thought. The Vorath never stood a chance. Then he got ready for the next 3 months, because that was the next obvious thing, and he had gotten quite good at those.